It looked like a flying trash can, but this bizarre aircraft may have secretly changed aviation forever.
When it spun, it pulled air in from the front and pushed it out the back, helping to make the propeller work better and produce more thrust. The Stipa-Caproni took its first flight on the 7th of October 1932.
In 1932, Italy built a strange barrel-shaped aircraft, so stable and futuristic that some believe it inspired modern jets. Imagine standing at an airfield in 1932 and suddenly seeing a giant flying barrel rolling toward the runway. No sleek nose, no elegant body, just a massive hollow tube with wings awkwardly bolted onto the sides. People genuinely thought it looked ridiculous. Some compared it to a dustbin with wings. Others laughed at it before it even left the ground. And honestly, they had a point. Compared to the sharp, streamlined aircraft of the era, this thing looked completely insane. Pilots nicknamed it the flying barrel, and from certain angles it barely even looked capable of flight. But then, something strange happened. The ugly machine actually worked. Not only did it fly, but test pilots claimed it was unbelievably stable, almost impossible to stall or crash. And suddenly, people started asking a dangerous question. What if this weird little aircraft was actually decades ahead of its time? The early 1930s were absolute chaos for aviation. Engineers across the world were experimenting with bizarre aircraft shapes, giant wings, strange engines, and radical new ideas almost every month. Everyone wanted to build the future first. Faster planes, safer planes, bigger planes. Aviation had become more than transportation. It was now a symbol of national power, and Fascist Italy desperately wanted to prove it belonged at the top. The government had already gained attention with aircraft, like the Savoia Marchetti S-55, but officials wanted something even more revolutionary, something no other country had dared to attempt. So when a quiet Italian engineer arrived with drawings of a giant flying tube, the Air Ministry immediately paid attention. Because Luigi Stipa wasn't thinking like everyone else. Not even close. Luigi Stipa wasn't some eccentric inventor hiding in a garage. He was an incredibly educated engineer who became obsessed with one simple question: how do you make aircraft more efficient? Born in Italy in 1900, Stipa showed an early passion for engineering and mechanics, but World War I interrupted everything. Like many young men of his generation, he left school and joined the military, serving with the Italian army before eventually returning home after the war ended. But this is where things get interesting. Instead of choosing just one field, Stipa studied almost everything connected to engineering. He earned degrees in aeronautical engineering, hydraulic engineering, and civil engineering before joining the Italian Air Ministry itself. Eventually, he rose to become General Inspector of the Engineering Division, a serious position with serious influence. And during the 1920s, Italian engineer Luigi Stipa became obsessed with something most aircraft designers barely paid attention to at all: airflow. While aviation pioneers across Europe chased bigger engines, stronger wings, and faster aircraft, Stipa focused on the invisible forces moving around the airplane itself: pressure, velocity, fluid dynamics. He believed conventional aircraft were wasting enormous amounts of energy every second they flew through the sky. Most engineers dismissed his theories as impractical, but Stipa kept going anyway, because deep down, he believed he had discovered something revolutionary. At the center of his idea was the Venturi effect, the principle that fluids move faster when forced through narrower spaces. Hydraulic engineers already understood this with water rushing through pipes. But Stipa had a radical thought. What if the exact same principle could be applied to air moving through an aircraft? And this was where everything changed. Instead of mounting a propeller normally at the front of the plane, Stipa placed the entire engine and propeller inside a massive hollow tube. He called the design the Intubed Propeller. As the propeller spun, air would compress inside the narrowing fuselage before blasting out the rear at higher speed. In theory, this compressed airflow would increase thrust, reduce turbulence, and even generate additional lift around the tube itself. To prove the concept, Stipa spent years building small models and testing them in wind tunnels. Slowly, he discovered something astonishing. The inside of the tube behaved almost like a rolled-up aircraft wing. The fuselage itself was helping produce lift. Suddenly, the bizarre barrel shape started making scientific sense. Now hold on, because this next part matters. Modern turbofan engines use surprisingly similar airflow principles today. And while the flying barrel looked ridiculous in 1932, some aviation historians now believe Stipa may have accidentally created one of the earliest ancestors of modern jet propulsion. At the time, though, almost nobody understood what they were looking at. If anyone in Italy was willing to build a flying barrel, it was aircraft designer Giovanni Caproni. By the early 1930s, Caproni had already earned a reputation for building some of the strangest aircraft on Earth: giant bombers, experimental flying boats, and bizarre multi-wing machines like the enormous Caproni CA-60 Noviplano. His company wasn't afraid of impossible ideas. So, when the Italian Air Ministry approved Stipa's project in 1932, Caproni became the obvious choice. Construction began soon afterward, and workers slowly assembled one of the weirdest aircraft ever attempted. As the machine took shape inside the factory, people couldn't stop staring at it. The fuselage wasn't really a fuselage at all. It was a giant hollow barrel, open at the front, open at the back, and squeezed tighter in the middle like a massive metal hourglass. The entire airplane was built around this tube, making it look less like an aircraft and more like an engine someone accidentally attached wings to. And those wings looked tiny. Thin elliptical wings stretched awkwardly from the sides of the barrel, while a hump-shaped cockpit sat on top with two tandem seats squeezed inside. From some angles, it looked futuristic. From others, completely absurd. But underneath the bizarre appearance was surprisingly clever engineering. Inside the tube were massive circular spars connected by ribs and structural supports, similar to a normal aircraft wing. Stipa essentially treated the fuselage itself like a rolled-up airfoil. But the complicated layout created problems too. Cockpit visibility was terrible, especially during takeoff and landing, because the giant curved fuselage blocked huge sections of the pilot's view. Power came from a 120 horsepower de Havilland Gypsy, 3-engine mounted directly inside the tube. As the propeller spun, compressed air blasted through the narrowing fuselage before shooting out the rear. Even the rudder and elevator sat directly inside the prop wash, allowing airflow to constantly hit the control surfaces. In theory, it should have made the aircraft safer and easier to control. But behind the scenes, compromises were already damaging the project. To simplify construction, parts of Stipa's original aerodynamic design had been altered. Extra supports increased weight. Structural modifications created additional drag. And with every change, the flying barrel became slower and heavier than Stipa intended. Nobody realized it yet, but the aircraft was already fighting against its own future. October 7, 1932. On that morning, the strange little aircraft rolled out for its very first flight. Crowds gathered around the airfield, staring at the machine in confusion. Some laughed openly. Others just stood there trying to figure out what they were even looking at. Because honestly, it barely resembled an airplane at all. It looked like somebody had attached wings and wheels to a giant metal drum. Behind the controls was veteran test pilot Domenico Antonini, a man already famous for flying Caproni's strangest creations. He reportedly approached the aircraft with caution. As the engine started roaring inside the hollow fuselage, the entire machine vibrated like a giant organ pipe. And then, slowly, the flying barrel began taxiing toward the runway. And somehow it looked even stranger in motion. The tiny landing gear made the aircraft sit extremely low to the ground, almost like it was skimming across the runway rather than rolling on it. Spectators expected disaster. Some probably expected the thing to flip over before even taking off. But Antonini pushed the throttle forward, and the impossible happened. The barrel lifted cleanly into the air. Not violently, not awkwardly, smoothly. And suddenly the laughter stopped. Instead of wobbling or fighting itself, the aircraft behaved calmly and predictably. Antonini later reported that it was surprisingly easy to handle, especially at lower speeds. Engineers watching from below could barely believe it. The airflow system actually seemed to work. Even ground handling had been remarkably stable thanks to the wide undercarriage and low center of gravity. But here's what nobody knew yet. The real shock would come during the following test flights, when pilots began discovering just how strangely stable this bizarre aircraft really was. As testing continued, the flying barrel quickly developed a bizarre reputation. Pilots discovered the aircraft could fly incredibly slowly without losing control. Its landing speed was extremely low, and it could take off and land in surprisingly short distances. In an era where stalls regularly killed pilots, this immediately got people's attention. And then, the rumors started. Some pilots claimed the aircraft felt almost impossible to stall completely. Because the propeller constantly forced airflow over the tail surfaces, the rudder and elevators remained responsive even at low speeds. The aircraft stayed unusually stable in situations where many conventional planes would become dangerous or unpredictable. But that stability came with a strange side effect. Some test pilots complained the aircraft almost resisted turning, like it wanted to keep flying straight no matter what. Still, most agreed it felt safer and calmer than expected. It was even quieter than many aircraft with similar engines, because the giant tube softened the propeller noise. And honestly, that's part of why people still love it today. Modern aviation constantly searches for safer aircraft designs, especially with drones, ducted fans, and experimental VTOL systems becoming more common. And when people look back at the flying barrel now, they don't just see a weird airplane anymore. They see an idea that may have arrived decades too early. But then came the problem nobody could ignore. The giant tube created enormous aerodynamic drag. While the in-tuned propeller improved airflow efficiency in some ways, the bulky fuselage also slowed the aircraft dramatically. The gains and losses basically canceled each other out. And despite all the revolutionary ideas behind it, the flying barrel only reached relatively low speeds. Worse still, the little 120 horsepower engine struggled constantly. Push it too hard, and it risked serious mechanical failure. Stipa had originally imagined much larger aircraft with more powerful engines where the concept might work properly. But government budget limits forced him into building a smaller prototype instead. And eventually, the Italian Air Force lost patience. The aircraft was fascinating, but it simply wasn't practical enough to continue funding. For Luigi Stipa, the flying barrel was never supposed to be the final product. It was only the beginning. He imagined massive multi-engine aircraft using the same airflow principles: flying wings, long-range bombers. Some concepts even featured 6 engines buried inside enormous tubular fuselages. Stipa believed larger aircraft would benefit far more from the design because bigger engines could better exploit the compressed airflow system. And honestly, he may have been right. But the timing was terrible. Military priorities were changing fast, governments wanted immediate practical results, and experimental aviation projects became harder to justify financially. Without additional funding, Stipa's larger concepts never left the drawing board. The flying barrel remained a lonely prototype, a glimpse of a future that never arrived. Even though the project ended, the flying barrel refused to disappear completely. Engineers around the world noticed it. The American NACA organization studied the aircraft carefully, while designers in France, Germany, Britain, and the United States examined Stipa's airflow theories. Because, despite its flaws, the concept looked strangely familiar to technologies that would appear years later. The similarities to turbofan engines were impossible to ignore. In Germany, engineer Ludwig Korth later developed the Korth nozzle system using related ducted flow principles. In France, designers even explored a futuristic bomber called the BN-4, based partly on Stipa's ideas. And then in 1940, Italy unveiled something even stranger: the Caproni Campini N1. The aircraft used a ducted fan compressor buried inside the fuselage, feeding compressed air into a combustion chamber at the rear. It was horribly inefficient. But it also became one of the world's earliest aircraft to use afterburning principles. Years later, Stipa became convinced German engineers had copied his ideas while developing jet propulsion systems. Historians still debate those claims today, because pulse jets and turbojets operated very differently from his intubed propeller system. But one thing is undeniable. Long before modern jetliners existed, Luigi Stipa was already thinking about controlling airflow in ways that sounded unbelievably futuristic. For decades, the Stipa-Caproni faded into obscurity. Then the internet arrived, and suddenly people rediscovered it. Aviation historians began reassessing the aircraft, realizing it wasn't just a bizarre joke machine from the 1930s. It was an experimental stepping stone toward ideas that later became incredibly important. And naturally, people online became obsessed with its absurd appearance. In the 1990s, aviation enthusiasts Lynette Zuccoli and Aerotech Queensland built a detailed flying replica in Australia. Amazingly, the recreated flying barrel actually flew in 2001, proving once again that the strange design genuinely worked. Today, the replica sits on display at Toowoomba Aerodrome, where visitors still stop and stare at it in disbelief. Because even now, nearly a century later, it still looks like something from the future. There's something weirdly fascinating about impossible-looking aircraft, especially ones that somehow worked anyway. Modern audiences love the flying barrel because it feels completely out of place in history. It looks like a failed science fiction experiment, yet it introduced ideas connected to ducted fans, airflow control, and ultra-stable flight decades before they became mainstream. That's why people online constantly call it uncrashable, even if that claim is slightly exaggerated. And honestly, the parallels today are hard to ignore. Modern drones, ducted fan aircraft, and VTOL concepts all rely heavily on controlled airflow systems similar in spirit to Stipa's ideas. With lightweight materials and powerful engines, some engineers believe the concept could perform far better today than it did in 1932. So maybe Luigi Stipa wasn't wrong. Maybe he was simply born too early. Because sometimes, history laughs at geniuses before finally understanding them. The Stipa-Caproni may have looked ridiculous, but beneath its barrel-shaped body was an idea decades ahead of its time. It never became a success, yet its strange legacy still echoes through modern aviation. And perhaps that's why the world still can't stop talking about the flying barrel.